Hi, I'm Dave Sohigian, and this is going to be a seminar on explaining generations. And if you want more information about generations and the cycles that we go through in the United States, go to my website, www.thegenxfiles.com. Hey, so what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the theories from the book The Fourth Turning by Neil Howe and William Strauss. It was written back in 1997, and it does a great job of predicting the current events as well as events that will be probably happening in the near future. And I think although it's a challenging read because it's several hundred pages long, fairly dense text, it's definitely worthwhile. But if you don't have time for that, it's a good thing that you're here, because I'm going to be able to explain some of the basic concepts of the book, and you'll be able to get a lot out of this short seminar. So let's start by defining one of the generations, and that's the Boomer generation, born 1943 to 1960. And I'm not going to spend much time arguing about when the different people believe the generation started and ended. Mainly, I want to talk about the character of that generation. So the baby boomer generation, born after the war, mainly after the war, and these are the young people in the 1960s that were protesting. They had lots of different ideals, and really this whole talk is going to be about the generation's relationships with ideals. They preached about all these different ideals. That's what you heard, was these conflicting ideals in the 1960s, coming about in the 70s and 80s, and even as they took leadership. Great examples of Boomer generation leaders: Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. Very different ideals, beliefs about what the ideal society would look like, and those ideals clash. And that's what we've seen in our society over the last 20 years, is a clash of those different ideals and the culture wars that have gone on, because, in large part, because of the discussions these boomers have had and the way that they've shaken up society during that time. So there's another generation. So that's the first generation we'll be talking about, and their ideals. The next generation is Generation X. This is my generation, born 1961 to 1981. And because of what they heard during their youth, what we all heard during our youth about ideals, we were entirely jaded by the time that we hit young adulthood, and we, for the most part, and this is not true across the board, it's a generalization, and that's what generations are about, is we don't believe in any ideals. It's just like, look, we just need to survive. We need to be pragmatic, practical about how we're going about things. To be able to get by, we've got to just kind of set ideals aside for a little bit and maybe have goals, certainly have goals and even long-term goals, but we're not going to work towards an ideal state. We just don't have time for that. We're just trying to get by. So that's Generation X. Now, the generation that follows that is the millennial generation. And this generation, born 1982 to about 2005. It may have been 2001. It's still hard to tell when exactly this generation has, the end of this generation. But both of my kids are part of the millennial generation. Most of the kids graduate, the kids certainly graduating from colleges now, all the way down into maybe first or second grade, somewhere in there, are probably a millennial generation. This generation, in terms of its relationship with ideals, it builds on one ideal. Now, this ideal hasn't been picked yet, but the idea with the millennial generation is it is of the type that is going to, instead of believing in no ideals like the Gen Xers, they instead decide on one ideal and say, instead of just preaching about it like the boomers did, we're just going to build to that one ideal. And the great example of this is the previous generation that had the same character, and that was the GI generation, born 1901 to 1924. And this is the generation that fought in World War II, and once they were victorious in the 40s and 50s, they built this ideal society based on the American dream of the 1.4 kids and white picket fence and 2 cars, and everybody can enjoy this life. That was the ideal that the GI generation built. And the millennial generation, although it hasn't chosen what that ideal will be yet, we don't know yet, is going to be building on some ideal as well. Now, there's one other generation I'm going to be discussing here in just a minute, and that's the silent generation. The silent generation was born 1925 to 1942, so they fall between the GI generation and the boomer generation born after them. So each of these generations, they have their different view of ideals. The silent generation that came between the one ideal of the GI, the American dream, and the many ideals being preached by the boomers, they kind of ended up being squeezed between the two and wanted to help. They believed in many ideals, and they wanted to help them all get along. Can't we all just get along might be the motto for the silent generation, 1925 to 1942. There hasn't been a president from this generation. John McCain was part of this generation. That believing in many ideals and trying to find a way to get these generations to get along was really the goal of the silent generation. We'll show how that comes into play next. So that's all the different generations that we'll be discussing, and I'll put all of them up here so you can see them basically in order through the different generations: GI, silent, boomer, Generation X, and millennial generation. And next we'll talk about how these generations relate to each other and the effects on our society because of it. So now that we understand the generations, let's start with the boomer generation and its relationship with the next generation that came along. So we mentioned already that the boomer generation preached these many ideals, and the Generation X, born in 1961 to 1981, ended up just not believing in any ideals. And that's really this cycle that happens. As we flow from one generation to the next, they end up rejecting the values of the previous generation, because by the growing up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they saw that having all these different ideals just clashed and really didn't result in anything positive, so they didn't want to have anything to do with it. The other effect on the Generation X that really pushed them believing in no ideals was the generation that came before, which was the silent generation. And in many ways, there's a parent-child relationship here. My parents were silent generation. Many Generation X, the later ones, parents were the boomer generation. But there is also a rebellion that happens here between the parents, the silents, and the children, the Generation X. These silents, remember, they believed in many ideals, and because of that, the pressure of hearing lots of ideals preached, a belief in many ideals, they just decided, forget it, we're not going to believe any of this. So that's the effects on the generation, these two pressures causing this result of the lack of belief in the generation, or in ideals. So let's put the millennials on here, and if we we can remove the silence for now. The millennials are under pressure from Generation X that are telling them, hey, look, we just want you to survive, we want you to do well, and we want you to be successful, but perhaps money is the only thing that matters, you can't worry about ideals. They don't buy into that, and they do believe in an ideal, but they also are rebelling against their parents who spent all of their time preaching about all these different ideals, and instead they're going to say, look, wait a minute, we believe in ideals. We aren't going to just stand around and talk about it. We're going to go ahead and build to this one ideal. Now, which is that ideal? And that's really the key. That's the seed that's being laid right now for this young millennial generation. Is what is the ideal they're building to? Is it Barack Obama's vision? Is it another vision? And what exactly is it that the millennial generation, the society, the ideal society, what is the American dream that they're going to be building? And if we look back to that GI generation, which is again of the same characteristic, was under pressure from their previous generations to build that ideal, they caused the rebellion that followed next with the boomer generation that rejected that idea of the single American dream. So this millennial generation will be under that pressure from the boomer and the Generation X, saying don't believe in anything, the kind of existentialist generation, the boomer generation preaching believe in this, no believe in this, no believe in this, and they're going to come to a decision where they build that on that one ideal. And that's a fundamental characteristic that is worth noting. And if we look at all the different generations here all together and what their belief systems are, you can see them all together. The nice thing about this diagram is that you can easily draw this on a whiteboard to be able to help people understand the relationships between these generations and how we follow through the same cycle. The one last thing is, if I flip these over, you can see on the back of each of them there is the archetype, the characteristic associated with each of these generations. And the silence being the artist archetype that believe in many ideals, the prophet archetype with the boomers that preach many ideals, the nomad of Generation X that believe in no ideals, and the hero, the millennials, or the GI generation that are also heroes, they build the one ideal. So each of these archetypes are described in greater detail on my website. So again, if you want to go to the website, it's www.thegenxfiles.com. There's more diagrams and charts to help explain this, and also further webinars. I hope you've enjoyed this short session, and it's helped you understand the relationships between the generations and how it can show where we're going next if we can just figure out what exactly those millennials are going to build.